Commission of Inquiry into Tax Administration and Governance at SARS is about to get underway in Pretoria. We cross live to Naledi Molefe on that one.
I've been appointed as the Commissioner, and the President has also appointed Mr. Katz, Mr. Kashler and Advocate Masilo to assist the Commission. Advocate Steinberg and Advocate Sio, who's not able to be here at the moment, will be assisting the Commissioner's Council. The Secretary of the Commission is Ms. Nkubani, who's put up her hand, thank you, who's been seconded from the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development. And I'd like any inquiries to go through the Secretary of the Commission. As I said to the media earlier, if you receive anything that does not have the name of the Secretary underneath or mine, it doesn't come from the Commission and it's not authorised from the Commission. We've got very short deadlines set by the President and a large number of issues to inquire into. We think, and I'm sure the President does, which is why he set such short deadlines, that this is a very important inquiry. SARS has, in the last few years, there have been many allegations about SARS. It has been brought into disrepute in various ways. And SARS is a very important institution for the state. From the inquiries we've made thus far, there are certainly some things of concern that we'll be inquiring into, and the inquiry will be conducted in order to be as efficient and as quick as possible in reaching proper conclusions. The terms of reference are very extensive, as you've seen. Many of the questions we're required to answer are fairly discrete questions. And that, I think, is going to dictate the way this Commission goes about its business. We will not be waiting until we've investigated everything and then starting public hearings in order to go on for months trying to analyse things in public hearings. It'll be a lot more productive to take these discrete issues, look at them, where necessary, have public hearings, and in the meantime, other inquiries will be carrying on, and I think that that is the most efficient way in order to do our work. The public is obviously entitled to know what is happening and to hear the evidence, and we welcome any interaction with the media on that. I hope that we will get on together. I don't like in these things to give directives or make orders. I hope that we get cooperation rather than people being coerced, and that applies as well to witnesses who will be called. We prefer them to be voluntary witnesses. One gets better evidence from people who are willing to give evidence than from those who are coerced. There are some restrictions, though, on the information that could be made public. The major one, as you'll realise, is that some of these terms of reference require access to taxpayer information. Now, you'll know that in legislation, taxpayer information is confidential. It's recognised that that should be the case all over the world. That will generally be dealt with privately. We will respect taxpayer confidentiality. I can see very few circumstances, if any, in which taxpayer information is going to be revealed. So as far as taxpayers are concerned, they should feel confident that the information they've provided in confidence will remain in confidence, except if there are very, very strong circumstances which require any disclosure. Many of the questions we're asked to look at over here will require careful scrutiny of documents. That's not the kind of thing one can do in public hearings. One needs to collect up the documents, examine them carefully, and what emerges from that might be the subject of public inquiry. But a lot of the work of this Commission is going to have to involve people who are assisting the Commission and the Commission itself examining with great care documents that have been produced. We've already called for many documents. Many have been produced. They will all require to be analysed, and that will be taking place as we go along. Some of the evidence as well, it will be convenient and expeditious to have it given on affidavit. We'll examine the affidavits and see whether the people need to be called to be examined in the proceedings. But so the evidence you can expect will be in a number of forms. Some of it will be transcribed here, be heard in public. Some of it will be received on affidavit, and some of it will simply be documentary evidence. So far as it is not confidential, I want to try and make sure, though, that in whatever form the evidence comes, it will be available to the public. They can scrutinize it. Precisely how that will be done, I haven't quite worked out yet. It'll certainly be available in hard copy form. It might be that we're able to distribute it, make it available electronically, which will make it easier for people to access, but that is a logistical thing that we still have to work out. But all the evidence that is not confidential will form part of the record, and the record I have in mind will be available for scrutiny, so that even the evidence that we don't hear in public will be available to you. I think one must also understand the nature of a commission of inquiry. It is not an adversarial process. No one is on trial. It is an inquiry to establish the facts that we've been asked to establish, where necessary to make recommendations. And we're assisted in that undertaking by Advocate Steinberg and Advocate Seo. It is important to appreciate their role. Their role is not simply to be passively placing evidence before us. Where necessary, they will examine that evidence. If there are problems with it, if we're skeptical of some of the evidence, their job will be to examine that evidence and to probe that evidence. Where we are skeptical, we will instruct her to probe that evidence. So if there are people who feel that evidence is not truthful, or if there are non-disclosures in evidence, the place to go to is to Advocate Steinberg, raise your concerns with her, and she will decide how far to examine the evidence. This is a matter of practicality. The hearings will commence at 9:30. We'll break for tea at 11 for 15 minutes, and we'll break at 1 o'clock for lunch for an hour, and we hope to end every day at 4 o'clock, but if necessary, we'll go on for a longer time. We want to use all the time available in order to hear all the evidence. I think, Mr. Steinberg, is that anything else I need to say? Michael? Well, okay, I think that we'll... Minister Gordhan is giving evidence this afternoon. I think we're going to just break for 5 minutes while he gets himself ready to give the evidence, and then we'll proceed. Very good.
A message from the Association for Alcohol Responsibility and Education, aware.org.
As democracy matures, we get into discussing very, very sensitive issues.
I think that there's a lot of people that are applauding it. I'm sure it's going to be appealed.
It is the beginning of a long journey of South Africa fighting racism.
That sticky label of being a white party, so to speak, doesn't seem to want to go away.
So the competition actually helps, and it brings out winning in total.
Stay tuned to Media Monitored every Sunday from 9 a.m.
This brings into question just the current situation, that we are in crisis, that we are not protecting our children even after a criminal case is opened.
It's very difficult to negotiate until to communicate to you as to where exactly are we, because we have presented a comprehensive package.
We have compromised a lot, and if ESCOM is not going to be in their senses, they will really be giving us, putting us into a serious problem.
The story of refugees is one of resilience, perseverance, and courage. Ours must be of solidarity, compassion, and action.
If they will be coming here and say they want everything free from Home Affairs, we can't do that.
To do application for passport is a very, very big problem. They don't allow the person to have a passport as a refugee.
We visit all the best spots for some live jazz performances. Traveling to breathtaking holiday destinations is what we like doing. Enjoying outdoor adventures with family and friends. Relish global cuisines.
Part of cooking.
For all the tourism, delicious cuisines and outdoor adventures, join us on Trends Travel every Sunday at 12 o'clock right here on the SABC News channel.
SABC News celebrates Youth Month.
Testicular cancer is the most common cancer in men between 15 and 39. But if picked up early enough, there's a 95% chance of survival. The Cancer Association of South Africa knew that if they could find a way to get a conversation started, they'd be able to increase the chances of early detection. Problem is, South African guys really don't like talking about personal stuff.
The lifetime risk for prostate cancer in men in South Africa is 1 in 18, according to the 2013 National Cancer Registry. Meet Johan Foster. He is a retired bank director. He recently found out he has prostate cancer right after undergoing a heart operation.
What happened is I went for a 6-monthly checkup with a cardiologist because I had a heart operation last year. And with a blood test.
Mom, what's going to happen to us when you die?
Ulebo angathola i-life cover ka-1 million rand eqala ku-155 rand kuphela ngenyanga ukuqinisekisa ikusasa lomndeni wakhe. Ukuthola i-code SMS-a u-impilo ku-48854. Otherwise ukhethe umshwalense ngobuhlakani.
Keeps the society in terror and pain. Why so?
If someone phones me, this phones me, tells me, okay, look here, he needs a silver. And I get you all driving, I'll take it.
What pushes normal people to be so hard, heartless, and brutally kill one another?
The other side of it could be more for their own psychological need. It might be part of a sexual fantasy that they have. It could be about power and control.
After proper investigation is followed, the perpetrator gets arrested.
There is quite a massive process. And ultimately, they are criminals, so I think justice is served.
Emotional scars remain.
We would pay any price to get him back, and the sad reality is that it's gone.
Special assignment. We unravel the truth every Sunday at 21:30.
SABC News celebrates Youth Month.
There were 56,000 new jobs created in the economy between January and March this year. That's according to the latest employment figures released by Stats SA a moment ago. Well, we're going to go to the Commission of Inquiry into Tax Administration and Governance at SARS. It's about to get underway. Let's cross there now.
Mr. Godon, thank you very much for attending today. I know there are pressing things on your time. May I just indicate what we're interested in your evidence? You know, we are required to inquire into events at SARS from the 1st of April 2014 to the 31st of March 2018. It's that 4-year period. What we need to understand is what happened in SARS during that period, and the best starting point is to know what the position was in April 2014. Now, by then you were no longer the commissioner. I think you had been out of the position for approximately 2 years. But as we understand it, what you had set up and the architecture that you had set up continued for over those years, and it was largely your architecture that existed in April of 2014. And so we thought that we'd like to hear from you as the architect of that structure. I think I should also mention that during that 4-year period, you were the Minister of Finance for part of that period. At this stage, we're not interested in your evidence as Minister of Finance. I think that we're going to have to ask you to come back at some stage to deal with events that occurred there in your position as Minister of Finance. But for the moment, we're only interested in your position as Commissioner. At the outset, can I ask you whether you affirm that the evidence you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If you so affirm, will you say, I do?
I affirm.
Yes.
Minister Gordhan, you were appointed Commissioner of SARS in 1999, and left in 2009. We want to talk about the institution that you built, your operating model, and what you achieved. But to start with, could you tell us broadly what the philosophy was, what the vision was of the new SARS?
Well, Judge and your fellow commissioners and Advocate Steinberg and members of the media and public, firstly, thank you for the invitation to be here. 1999 is a long way back, but what we have prepared for you, Judge, is a presentation based 99% on slides prepared during the course of the SARS journey and its transformation process. So virtually none of the slides that I'm going to present were manufactured yesterday. They're from records of the organization going back to that period, and I'll take you through that in a moment.
May I just ask you, Minister, is it preferable for us to go and sit there and watch this screen, or just look at the hard copy that you've given us?
In the old days, they say when you watch the bioscope, you sit this side.
We do that. Sure.
And you have the paper copy as well. So by way of introduction, before I get into the first of the slides, Judge and your colleagues, I think we need to place SARS and that whole period of 98, 99 and beyond in the context of the fact that in 1994, South Africa became a democratic republic. And part of the process that follows from the onset of democracy is the creation of new political institutions, economic institutions, and indeed cultural and other institutions as well. And once we had the Constitution of 1996, various institutions in relation to the Constitution, in addition to the ones I've already mentioned. I think we would all agree that institutions, both in terms of the actual organization and custom and convention, play a very important part in society. In the case of a revenue service, if we establish the institution of tax compliance early enough in a democracy, as we've learned from many other countries in the world, both in a negative and in a positive sense, then the economic future and the fiscal future of the country follows a particular path. The then Minister of Finance, Mr. Manuel, coined the phrase fiscal sovereignty. So in 1994, we became politically sovereign. But the key issue was how do we attain fiscal sovereignty given our fiscal inheritance from the apartheid period, be that in relation to growth, debt, interest payments on debt, and the deficit that the new democratic government actually inherited at the time. But the fiscal system, of course, has many parts to it, the expenditure part and the tax part. And the tax part has two components that constitute the tax system: tax policy and tax administration. And in most societies and economies, it is the tax system that plays the key redistributive role. And that applies in our case as well. So by the time we get to about 2009, 10, 11, our social wage, for example, which includes expenditure on social grants, education, health, and other such items, constituted over 55% of the total non-interest expenditure of government. But I take you back to your colleague on your left, who on the 22nd of June 1994 was appointed by President Mandela to head the now famous Katz Commission, which presented his first interim report on tax policy and tax administration. And so started not only the SARS journey, but also the transformation of tax policy in South Africa as well. And the two key elements in that report were recommendations on, firstly, broadening the tax base, and later renewing our tax policy base, if you like, and secondly, creating a good tax administration, which included the customs component as well. Minister Manuel at the time and Deputy Minister Jill Marcus then acted upon the Katz Commission report when they became Minister and Deputy Minister in 1996, once the Government of National Unity, which I'm sure many of us have forgotten about now, came into being. And amongst the first tasks that Ms. Marcus set for herself is to get external assistance for what were initially departments of Customs and Excise and departments of Finance, later in 1996, SARS as we know it today, and then 1997, an autonomous SARS in terms of the SARS Act. And so it's important to remind oneself that on the customs side, it was the United Kingdom's customs officials who were seconded to customs in South Africa, who began retraining our customs staff and reorientating them. Similarly, the Swedish Tax Board provided tax experts and IT experts to strengthen the SARS tax system, tax officials, and as I will indicate a little later, introduced us to some elements of the compliance model that we practice later. Of course, we linked all of that to what we call the higher purpose, which we'll come to in a moment as well, which was important because what we wanted to indicate to our staff and to others as well, that by working at SARS, you are not just a rubber stamping official or bureaucrat or an administrative element within a big establishment, but that we were, in fact, if we worked well and worked diligently and worked with integrity, actually reinforcing the democracy that had just been established and providing the fiscal resources that were necessary for government to actually overcome the legacies of apartheid. So there was a direct link in how well SARS performed on the one hand, the tax policy framework that the Treasury provided on the other hand, and the fiscal objectives and socio-economic objectives that government set in our new democracy at the time. I must point out that, firstly, none of this is an individual achievement. It was a collective achievement, both of successive management teams that were at SARS from 1999 onwards, but in particular, the 12,000 odd staff that we had at various stages, that increased to 14,000 at some stage, who became active participants, with a few exceptions, in the process of transforming SARS. And that was a singular success in terms of mobilizing that number of people behind a change process and being enthusiastic about it as well, rather than working by diktat and by instructions or directives, as you pointed out earlier. Two other elements that are important in an introductory sense is, firstly, we were not shy to learn from the best. So if we didn't know anything, we had many international links, both on the customs side and the tax side. We would either ask people to visit South Africa, or we would send officials to visit them and learn from them what constituted best practice. A very good example, which I will come to at the latter stages of this presentation, is the Large Business Center, which was a practice introduced in the United States and in the UK and in Australia, in which we then mimicked, if you like, and adapted to our own circumstances. But the second, Judge, is that we didn't have a textbook that we followed. This was also learning by doing. There was no magic formula, except perhaps some principles that some of us had learned as activists in the political struggle that guided us as to what and how we approach the question of transforming an institution like SARS. So if you like, non-racialism was an important principle, as was non-sexism, and we tried to reflect it in the way in which SARS transformed. We introduced elements of what we might call progressive activism. In other words, keep the democratic ideal in mind and tailor the institution to serve that ideal. We had a clear but evolving vision. So as we learned more, we fine-tuned the vision, and you'll see that at various stages, the vision had to be revised and reactivated in order to meet the circumstances of the day, but also to be in line with the new lessons that we've learned during this whole period. An important element, though, was what I might call the shaking of the conscience of South Africans. So by engagements and by persuasion and by enforcement, as you will see during the course of the presentation, we reminded citizens of what it meant to enjoy fiscal citizenship, to be good taxpayers in South Africa, to contribute to the transformation process, not only of SARS, but of the country as a whole. And it was a remarkable achievement for South Africans in a very short period of time. Mr. Katz has a lot of experience in this regard, to move from a situation where we were sanction busters, we paid very little tax in South Africa, and had a remarkably non-compliant culture, to one where I can't say we attained total compliance, but it was very significant both in the corporate world, but also as far as individuals were concerned. Much of the journey was guided by the fact that integrity was an important part of what we did. So very early on, probably 98, 99, we stopped all SARS staff from receiving gifts of any kind. The practice before that was you could take a customs or tax official for lunch, offer a bottle of whiskey a few times a day, or a month, hopefully not a day, and ensure that your forms were stamped before the forms of other people. And once the new management learned that this was a practice on the ground, that was stopped, including if you stole a toilet paper, you'd face tough disciplinary action. And that inculcated a culture, possibly of apprehension on the one hand, but certainly spread the message across the organization that we will not tolerate corruption in any form whatsoever. We challenge big taxpayers and learn from those challenges. So there are big companies whose names will appear on your screen as early as 2000, 2001, and matters that then ultimately ended up in the Constitutional Court. We have a famous ruling on pay now and argue later. The electronics industry, some of us are old enough to remember grey electronic goods coming into the country at the time. You don't hear about it today at all, so the younger generation won't know too much about that. We also embraced local initiatives. So once, as I will point out to you, the filing season process started in 2003, 2004. Some of our officers started offering tea and biscuits when people were queuing for too long. And that was their own initiative, spending their own money. And then that actually showed the kind of enthusiasm with which people served South Africans. So in sum, by 2014, if not earlier, The SARS was a world-class, modern, efficient, and respected tax and customs administration. South Africans who worked for SARS held their heads high, both within South Africa and indeed globally as well. And there are any number of studies which we will provide you with, at least to some extent, to demonstrate that whether it was within the top ranks of the OECD or studies done by the World Bank and other institutions, this institution stood well above the others, both on this continent, but indeed we are comparable to the best in the first world, so-called, as well. The institution and leadership was respected out there. We could attract the best chartered accountants, the best tax lawyers, although we didn't attract Mr. Katz at all, except on commissions. And people were proud to say that they worked for SARS. And would proudly want SARS and their stint at SARS to be part of their CV so that they could move on to higher office, if you like, within the private and public sector as well. And we became an example within government of what transformation could mean and what it could achieve, and what was possible, if you like, if we applied ourselves in the right kind of way. So these are some of the themes that will run through this presentation, Judge, and let me take you through that quickly. I must warn you, it's about 140 slides. I don't intend addressing all of them. But as I said, these are actual original slides to virtually the entire bunch that you're actually going to see. So we've divided it into 12 parts. The first is I've addressed already in some ways, the democratic breakthrough. The second, looking at fiscal policy, and in particular the relationship between tax policy and tax administration. The third, the SARS mandate as it was originally formulated and the foundations for transformation. The fourth, the SIACA process, which is what we titled the transformation process in South Africa, or in SARS. And the benchmarking that we did, as I pointed out, with international organizations. The operating model that emerged at various stages in the evolution of SARS, because that's quite a current topic. The compliance model and how we engage with different types of stakeholders. Our service proposition, Mr. Ho, I see, is here, so he'll be able to add a lot more of the contemporary information in relation to that. The concept of the filing season would really enthuse both staff and public, initially in submitting paper documents, but later largely electronically. Our enforcement machinery that was developed over the 10-year period, without which there will be no disincentive provided to tax fraudsters, and there too it was learning by doing. Education, which played an important part, particularly because the majority of our people were excluded from economic activity, and as new generations came into active employment or service during the post-apartheid era. The large business center, which I mentioned earlier on, and its origins, and of course you will inquire into its ultimate dismantling. Part 11, the people, the culture that we tried to inculcate, and the zero tolerance approach to corruption. And an important part, part 12, which is the customs transformation. This is plus minus the kind of journey that we've traveled. The Katz Commission being set up in 1994 and its report. 97, SARS is an autonomous agency. 98, 99, bringing the tax and customs components together in one building. 2000 to 2004, the SIACA process is actually initiated, and its successes in 2010 and the subsequent period. We've forgotten South Africa 20 years ago, but these are some of the factors that you will remember we contended with, both pre and post April 1994. This is quite instructive in terms of numbers. 84 to 93, growth 1%, and before the Great Recession, we reached even 4% of economic growth, which means that it played a significant but not the only part in the kind of tax collections that we had, as I will demonstrate in a moment. Inflation, 14.3% versus below 6% today. Deficit, 9.3%. You might remember we came down as low as a surplus of actually 1% in 2008. And it's the Great Recession that pushed us beyond that. And investment boycotts versus the inflows that we've seen, and stable ratings upgrades until recently as well. This is also looking back, so when you look at the slides, you can have a look at that. The SARS Act, the mandate is to administer all tax legislation, which includes both tax and customs, implement trade and industrial policy, but in fact advise the Minister of Finance as well, collect all revenue and operate within the scope of the PFMA. And the wider responsibility as an implication of the legal mandate is clearly to understand what the tax base looks like, both in the formal and informal sectors, and constantly the challenge for tax administrations and indeed tax policymakers is how do you widen the tax base as you go on. Because a wider tax base, as the latter period in the 2000s indicated, gave the then Minister of Finance the latitude to actually bring individual tax rates down. Some of you might remember the rebates you got at the time. Addressing the tax gap, which is not talked about too much these days, but was very current in the post-2000 period, which is the gap between that which your economy should be giving you as the tax collection and that which you actually collect. And there were various studies done by the IMF and then eventually by ourselves in SARS to get some grip on the unknown, which is the tax gap. But about a study in about 2000, the early 2000s by the IMF indicated that Denmark and Singapore were the only countries with zero tax gap. I doubt it, but that is what they came up with. The United States, with the fearsome IRS, had a 10% tax gap. So you can imagine where South Africa stood in that equation. And I think even now, the challenge is what does the tax gap look like? Where does it lie? What is its composition? And what machinery do you actually require and skills do you require in order to address the tax gap? Promote a new compliance culture, which was critical to us. We would have failed as an administration if society didn't respond the way they did during the 2000s and understand why tax needed to be paid, even if it was a grudging compliance at the time. But there's this famous quote about plucking a chicken without it hissing too much. In South Africa, we had very little hissing, I would argue, and except from particular constituencies. The ideal in the literature is voluntary compliance, but it's an ideal. It means that everybody understands what their tax obligations are, and without any enforcement technique being applied or disincentive being applied, you would voluntarily comply with your obligations. We also had a responsibility within our region, developing their tax and customs administrations, but also promoting trade and being mindful that customs should not act as a non-tariff barrier to trade within the region itself. So this gives you some sense of the journey from a rigid administrative organization to an externally focused organization. This is a critical element because often bureaucratic organizations look inward. In our case, we needed to constantly understand the marketplace. What was changing? Which tax segments were complying to what extent? And how were social changes happening and demographic changes that would influence the tax base? A government department within the public service, which is what the CATS Commission said we should change, and therefore you had an autonomous integrated organization. We should remind ourselves that up to 1994, there were 11 independent tax authorities in line with the Bantustan system, and those had to be integrated. And the people then in SARS did a remarkable job post-1994 to actually do so. Separate revenue, customs, and excise department, and we integrated them into a reasonably working organization. Uninspiring culture with low racial diversity, and the precise opposite is what we have now, notwithstanding certain utterings that we hear from time to time. A strong growth in revenue and the tax register, there are numbers to actually prove that. And obviously, we had a very small tax base. We still do to some extent compared to the population. But it's understandable in the context of the employment levels and economic engagement that we see within South Africa itself. Tax policy changes during this period. This is only a short list, but there were many more. But amongst the first set of changes in the early 2000s was the introduction of capital gains tax, changing from source to residence. I think at that stage we were one of 3 ex-colonial countries that had the source basis of taxation, and we changed that as well. And that was a fundamental change in philosophy on the tax policy side. There was a period around 2000, 2001 where the insurance industry had a particular legislative formula in terms of which they calculated tax that changed to, and I'm sure has evolved further from the 4 funds approach. But in that one tax year, about 2 billion rands was collected as a result of the legislative change. There have been changes on the tax on retirement funds, lots of debate around what is called GAR, the General Anti-Avoidance Rule in the mid-2000s, but which also gave the tax authorities some latitude on the one hand, created a little bit of uncertainty for the business sector, but certainly got the courts involved, Judge, a lot more when litigation took place around those issues. Preparation for a review of the secondary tax on companies, and then some of the others that you actually see there as well. Now, why is this important? You need an effective tax administration with the right kind of capability to translate policy pronouncements into an administrative machinery to collect money in terms of these policy changes. And over the years, if you read the budget speeches of ministers of finance, they'll say, no, we're announcing X and Y and Z change on the policy side. That's pretty useless if you don't have an administration that can translate it into a collecting mechanism. And that is a strong success factor on the SARS side as well. But similarly, on the trade side, there have been remarkable changes during this period as well. The SADC Free Trade Agreement, which is still in the process of evolving, but the SACU agreement with the European Union in terms of EFTA, various other bilateral treaties as well, the development of industrial development zones, and post 9/11 in the United States, the whole regime of imports and exports changed, and the last bullet point is just one example of the changes that happened in order to provide the U.S. with the necessary assurance that containers getting into the U.S. would be secure. And here's one example of the policy changes that happened within the World Customs Organization. What then are the drivers of revenue performance? I mean, we often hear the utterance that it's just the economy. It's not true. And throughout the rest of the slides, you'll see some of this happening. This is also an original version. We don't have a price on it yet. But obviously, the macroeconomic factors are quite critical. If the economy grows, it certainly provides more revenue. But a key element that tax economists look at is also tax buoyancy. So tax buoyancy over a period of time, which is one way of explaining how did SARS get targets or achieve targets that were beyond that which was estimated. So one explanation is the tax buoyancy element, but that's declined in the last few years to 1 and below, which is how they measure it. Tax gap strategies, so that's the importance of understanding the tax gap every few years for a tax administration. Which constituency that should be paying X amount of tax is paying Y amount of tax, which is less than X. So that's the one part. But the second part is, do you have the skills, for example, on transfer pricing or loopholes that are in tax legislation of various types to actually contend with the sophistication and the planning that goes into escaping tax responsibilities. And as a tax base gets wider, the threat of the tax gap becomes more significant as well. Anti-avoidance measures is what I've just referred to. Although the tax fraternity hasn't quite sorted out what avoidance and evasion is, and the demarcation between the two. But anti-avoidance measures is, let's call it, those aggressive practices which allow for a particular interpretation of the law in order that you could actually bypass the provisions of the law. And this, over the years, has given rise to interesting debates about the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. From the time I've entered SARS during that period, that has been pretty much the debate. Do you only look at the letter of the law, which some lawyers would do, whilst others will actually make allowance for the spirit of the law, i.e., fiscal citizenship does mean that you have a responsibility beyond what the letter of the law states in terms of your tax obligations. Every year you'll have I think it's called Annexure C, in the budget documentation, in the budget review, which sets out various loopholes that were identified in the previous year or previous years. And legislative changes are designed to actually cover those loopholes. The last one is what we will come back to a little later, is assessing efficiencies and quality. It's one thing to submit a tax return. It's another to be able to establish that you've submitted all the information that you need to submit. So if you have 5 different sources of income, for example, and only disclose 3, you haven't given all the information, firstly. But secondly, you need officials or machinery within SARS which would enable you to detect submissions, tax submissions that have been made that are, as Mr. Mandela would have said, less than frank in terms of disclosure. And where complexity comes in, from anti-avoidance measures to complex company legislation, etc., higher and higher levels of skills are required, particularly at company level, but also amongst high net worth individuals, to figure out what they're up to in the way in which they've structured their tax affairs. So if you lose skills in certain key nodes within the SARS operations, it begins to affect your assessing capability. It then begins to affect decisions that you make about what you find acceptable or unacceptable. And the easiest thing to do is find everything acceptable. That means now a significant amount of tax begins to escape your hands and the grip of a tax official. If there is an objection to your decision on the assessment, then you need qualified staff to adjudicate that objection. And if you very easily allow all objections, then you lose more money again as well. And I can carry on like that, but it's a combination of these and related factors that ultimately decide whether you are able to achieve as an organization the revenue target or not. These are numbers for tax collection from 1996 to 2006, and you can see the relative changes that have actually taken place. The last bullet point on your right-hand side is what the then Minister of Finance was able to achieve because of changes in compliance and the tax base, which is 69 billion rands in tax breaks for individual taxpayers. Those are some numbers again. So when we started asking the question, how does this organization become more efficient, effective, and transformed? Clearly, we needed a holistic approach. It's not a one-dimensional view of the organization. Change people and you'll change everything. Change the income tax system and you'll achieve everything. And what we're demonstrating in a moment is the multi-dimensional character of the transformation process, which included demographic or people changes, and gender included, systems changes, process changes, and culture changes, amongst others. But crucial to this is what we learned from the Swedish in particular, which is the compliance model. So around 98, 99, they taught us this model with just the 2 sides, service and enforcement. They said you should provide good service to good taxpayers. And on an incremental basis, you should be tough with your enforcement depending on the nature of the offense that has been committed and apply the right level of enforcement. So if you're a rank criminal, you should end up in orange uniforms. If you've just made an odd mistake in your calculation or in writing down a number, then we should help you to correct it and move on beyond that. We added a third element, which is education, given our own idiosyncratic context as well. But critical in driving the compliance model is to As we moved later into a more sophisticated understanding of what that tax administration could be, is on the left-hand side, effective segmentation. Not all taxpayers are the same. So if you are an individual earning one simple salary and no deductions that you actually wanted tax breaks on, then you are treated, you go through channel A, so to speak. If you're a multi-billionaire with complex tax planning, and there are a few of them around, then you need to go through a very different route with very different sets of skills that are actually applicable. If you're a small business, then we should ease the regulatory environment in which you work and make it as easy as possible for you to comply. If you're a large corporation, we don't want to make it difficult for you, but at the same time, there should be greater rigor in both assessing your tax return, but auditing them as well. So risk assessment becomes a critical element. What risks would you detect in which?
You're watching SABC News. It's just about 1500 hours Central African time. Now, that was a live crossing to the Commission of Inquiry into Tax Administration and Governance at SARS. They're, of course, holding the first public hearings of evidence from today until Friday. But for now, let's cross over to Port Elizabeth, where Mercedes-Benz South Africa will, this afternoon, make a huge